Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today we're looking at part 2 of what will eventually become my big chungus Matt Powell video, responding to his 40-minute video that claims to be the Christian response to evolution. In part 1, he didn't even manage to get to evolution, instead focusing on cosmology and abiogenesis, with a focus on how accumulation is impossible for some reason. What will he get into today? There's only one way to find out. Let's go!
And in creationism, we believe that dinosaurs lived recently.
Indeed, creationists do believe a bunch of things that are demonstrably false.
But according to evolution, dinosaurs lived 65 million years ago.
Incorrect. Dinosaurs did not live 65 million years ago, they went extinct about 66 million years ago. They lived during the Mesozoic, which was a span of time that ranged from 245 million years ago to 66 million years ago. I know that's what Matt was probably going for, and in the last video I did give him a gold star for getting this one right when he remembered to say the plus that came after the 65 in that statement, but honestly, I'm not sure he deserves the benefit of the doubt when it comes to misspeaking anymore. It wasn't that long ago that I would have just granted the idea that Matt knows what piles are, but we learned last time that this is a concept that is a bit too much for him to grasp. So yeah, maybe I'm nitpicking, but in this case, it might actually be necessary.
Let's go ahead and do some scientific analysis of this as well. Let's see who's correct. We find dinosaur blood cells in dinosaur bones that are supposedly 65 million years old.
We do not. We find structures that are morphologically similar to red blood cells, and which may indeed be made out of material that was original to the organism, but which are molecularly different, having gone through processes such as cross-linking, which render the materials less susceptible to degradation over time. To quote the paper that you are actually citing here, some regions of the demineralized bone matrix are highly fibrous, and the matrix possesses elasticity and resilience. 3 populations of microstructures have cell-like morphology. Thus, some dinosaurian soft tissues may retain some of their original flexibility, elasticity, and resilience.
These bioorganic materials that we're finding, like blood cells, blood vessels, hemoglobin in the blood, check this out, there's over 16 types of bioorganic materials that are found in dinosaur bones. They're all biodegradable. Remember, that's what bioorganic even means. It means that it's material that will biodegrade.
I mean, when I looked it up, it said that it was pertaining to the composition and biological activity of carbon-based compounds, especially those of laboratory rather than biogenic origin, so honestly, this sounds like you just trying to use a big word to sound smart, but failing because you're not. But yeah, the structures that they found are normally biodegradable, which is why some sort of preservation mechanism has to be at work in order to, preserve them. And while we do not have a perfect understanding of those mechanisms yet, we're getting there. We know that iron-mediated radical cross-linking, where iron reacts with oxygen to form iron oxides that form a protective coating around organic molecules and acts as a stabilizer, has the effect of protecting these structures from decay through the activity of things like bacteria and fungi, as well as the actions of the body's own enzymes. There's also the fact that these soft tissues are most likely found in bones that have been encased in mineral concretions, which are exactly what it sounds like they are. They're basically naturally occurring concrete that forms around the bones. The concretion protects the bones from groundwater, which would very rapidly destroy the soft tissue structures within them. So we find biomolecules that are morphologically similar to certain soft tissue structures, which are only ever found in the most protected areas of a fossil in conditions favorable to chemical processes that are known to preserve biomolecules for long periods of time. Color me unimpressed.
You have to ask this question. Could dinosaur blood last for 65 million years?
Pedantry about whether it's blood or biomolecules that are morphologically similar to blood cells aside, yes it could. Honestly though, if such soft tissues were an indication that the Earth is young, then why don't the majority of bones yield such tissues? If them being only thousands of years old instead of millions is why they're not fully permineralized, then why is it that so many of them are? Soft tissue would be the norm, not the exception, would it not? And yet, even for the soft tissue we do find, it's not actually soft and pliable until they put it in a solution that dissolves all the minerals that have been protecting the soft tissues this whole time.
The answer is no.
Only if you don't know what you're talking about, so yeah, I can't say I'm surprised here.
Some people will say that iron cross-linking somehow preserved the dinosaur blood.
Some people, being literally every paleontologist who has anything to do with it, yes.
Well, here's the thing. Even if you submerged that blood in iron and then sealed that for millions of years.
If you submerged blood in iron, Does Matt think that the way it works is blood cells are plunked down into molten iron? Does Matt not know that hemoglobin, one of the defining proteins of red blood cells, contains iron? Like, that's how your blood gets oxygen around the body. The oxygen binds to the iron in hemoglobin. Oh, and hey, there's oxygen, that second molecule that was important to the cross-linking process. Can't form iron oxides without the oxide part of oxide, after all. So, no, blood cells were not submerged in iron. They contain iron. That's kind of their whole shtick.
The blood is still going to deteriorate. Yes, iron can cause blood cells to be preserved for a short time, but for millions of years?
Why not? Do you have anything to back up the idea that it can't? Something more solid than just your personal incredulity would be preferred here.
Have you ever been to a relative's house and you see them can foods? That food that they have tried to seal up and preserve still will go bad over time, over just a few years in some cases.
I feel like there's a lot to unpack just in the question, have you ever been to a relative's house and seen them can food? Like, maybe Matt has never personally played around with canning on his own. I get it, you'd need to involve a stove in that, and not trusting Matt around a stove is a smart choice. But like, does Matt go to relatives' houses for like food canning parties or something? Is that a normal thing? Am I the weird one here? Are canning parties one of those American traditions that I'm just not aware of? Or is Matt the weird one here? I don't actually know. Whatever. That aside, canning food doesn't preserve the food by cross-linking. It preserves the food by removing things from the environment that cause the food to spoil. Oxygen, bacteria, fungi, etc. Assuming you follow the canning procedures perfectly, some foods can last several years, but yes, they will all go bad eventually. But the canning process did not alter the molecular structure of the food to make it more stable, it minimized the presence of factors that cause it to spoil. Cross-linking would be more akin to preserving the hide of a cow by putting it through the tanning process, where various chemicals are applied to facilitate, says here, cross-linking. Huh. What do you know? And given that we've found well-preserved leather artifacts that are nearly 6,000 years old, I'd say it's fairly reasonable to suggest that microscopic amounts of tissue that went through a similar preservation process as leather could survive for millions of years in very well-protected interiors of bones that are covered in concretions. Now, does Matt share my feeling that this is reasonable? Obviously not. But given that we have found microscopic amounts of highly cross-linked tissue in fossils that are demonstrably millions of years old, we have two options here. Either it is possible for such tissue to be preserved, or essentially all of paleontology and geology has to be thrown out at a minimum. Which, yeah, that is exactly what Matt is advocating for here, but using I have a hard time wrapping my tiny little brain around topics that I clearly don't understand as an argument against at least two entire fields of science just doesn't cut it.
And in the dinosaur bones, we also find carbon-14.
And notice that to support the claim that we found carbon-14 in dinosaur bones, he has a screenshot of an explanation of how carbon dating works, not an article or paper documenting the finding of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. Probably because the only papers documenting such finds are ones that explain why carbon dates for such specimens are unreliable, and they aren't subtle about it. They point out that radiocarbon that is found in dinosaur fossils is pretty much exclusively the result of contamination processes. Bacterial activity, recrystallization, uranium decay, and even the application of glue that is often used during the excavation process. Bacterial activity, I would hope, is obvious. Microbes live everywhere, and being carbon-based life, contain carbon. So as they go about their business, some of their carbon will contaminate whatever surface they are on. Recrystallization is the process by which fossils become permineralized. Over time, one mineral replaces another mineral. One common mineral that replaces the original material in fossils is calcite, the most stable form of calcium carbonate. You may notice from the name calcium carbonate that calcite contains carbon. Okay, I'll stop saying it like that. I'm sorry. So if the original bone material is replaced over time with a carbon-bearing mineral, then that means that this mineral will bring in radiocarbon that is not original to the organism and would throw off the dating process even if we could date such old specimens with carbon dating. You wouldn't be dating the animal whose bones made the fossil, you'd be dating the material that replaced those bones over a process that could have potentially taken thousands to millions of years. Uranium decay produces radiation that, if it interacts with nitrogen molecules, will produce carbon-14. This is actually basically the same process by which carbon-14 is produced in the atmosphere, except up there it's cosmic rays rather than exposure to uranium. And important to mention here, when carbon-14 decays, it becomes nitrogen-14. So any carbon-14 that has already decayed into nitrogen has the potential to be irradiated back into carbon-14. And then of course there's the use of glue during excavation. Plenty of glues contain carbon, so the use of one of those glues will, naturally, lead to contamination with carbon. Notably, even for samples that are young enough to be carbon dated, bones are not the preferred sample type, with bones only yielding accurate dates when the sample is younger than about 5,000 years.
Remember, carbon-14 only lasts 50,000 years. The half-life is 5,730 years, and so every 5,730 years, half of the C14 exits the bones.
No, absolutely not. That's not how any of this works. Carbon-14 doesn't just disappear, it decays into nitrogen. The nitrogen then stays put unless it's hit by radiation that can bump it back into being carbon-14. Given that this process is reversible, it stands to reason that there are situations where it can, in fact, be reversed. And as it turns out, there are.
Well, how is it that these bones are loaded with C14?
Loaded is being more than a touch hyperbolic. Best I can find is that some creationists got dates for Mesozoic fossils that were as young as 9,000 years old. Which, yes, does seem significant, but becomes rather obvious once you learn that scientists who use radiocarbon dating are well aware of the contamination processes that I've already described, and specifically with regards to bone samples, the contamination becomes significant and must be accounted for once a sample reaches an age of about 8,000 years. Now, of course, this does not mean that a maximally contaminated sample will yield a result of 8,000 years old. This lining up of dates is probably coincidental more than anything. But my main point here is that the older the sample is, the more of an impact contamination will play on the sample. This can generally be accounted for, but the uncertainty goes up as the sample gets older. Did the creationists that sent the Mesozoic fossil in for carbon dating do anything to account for this? Or were they just looking for any carbon-14 that they could just jump on in order to push their narrative? I think we all know the answer to that question.
That's because they died recently, because these bones are not millions of years old. They weren't sitting in the ground for millions of years and got contaminated by C14 from the atmosphere. That's not what happened.
You're right. That's not what happened. Atmospheric C14 generally doesn't contaminate samples, and specific to carbon dating, samples that are exposed are actually easier to date, because the contaminants are mostly things that are found in the ground. Bury a sample and the bacteria that is already in the dirt will go to work contaminating it right away, but there will be less bacterial exposure when exposed to the air. Like, when you get a minor cut that draws a bit of blood but doesn't need a band-aid, you wash it and then leave it exposed. You don't rub dirt in it because there's way more bacteria in dirt than there is in the air, so it's way more likely to get infected if you do that. Being exposed also minimizes the radiation it's exposed to that could potentially generate radiocarbon from nitrogen atoms. Carbon-14 in the atmosphere is mostly produced at high altitudes and near the poles where the magnetic field that protects us from cosmic radiation is weakest. So an exposed sample won't be impacted by the cosmic rays, but a buried sample has a very high chance of being close to uranium, as uranium is fairly ubiquitous in pretty much all types of rock and soil. It's small enough that it generally doesn't affect us out here in the atmosphere, but surround a sample with uranium-bearing rock and/or soil, and you will get the occasional nitrogen atom being hit and flipped into a carbon-14 atom.
If they would have been contaminated by C14, it would have been contaminated by other things, and therefore it would have contaminated the blood that we find in the bones, and the blood cells would be non-existent.
So, let me get this straight. If contamination by C14 were possible, some mysterious other things would also have contaminated the bone, and these other things would have destroyed the soft tissues? Like, that's not how contamination works. Different contaminants do their contaminating in different ways and under different circumstances. Does Matt think that when a produce company recalls some of their vegetables because of a listeria contamination, those vegetables must have been equally contaminated by literally everything that it is possible to contaminate something with? Of course that's not how it works. One form of contamination does not automatically mean that every other form of contamination has also taken place.
So you can look at this all sorts of different ways, and you can cross-reference these dinosaur findings, and just biologically, that's enough information for me to say, yes, God was right. Yes, the Bible is correct, that God created dinosaurs with man.
Does Matt even know what cross-referencing is? because it's what I've been doing here, or if I'm honest, it's what the researchers that I've been citing have been doing, because if you actually read my sources, you'll find that a lot of them refer directly to each other. And what's more, some of them even go as far as referencing creationist material, then checking the references that the creationists used, and then going back to those sources to see if they said what the creationist claims that they said. And it's usually either something that is removed from context, or is only applicable in very specific situations that are irrelevant to what the creationist is using it for. So these papers and articles are not just cross-referencing each other, they're cross-referencing the creationist cross-references. It's cross-referenceception up in here. Matt hasn't even provided a source for this claim, much less cross-reference that with any other source that supports it. I had to go digging for the creationist source making that claim because Matt couldn't even be bothered to show it.
The Bible says, "Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee. He eateth grass as an ox." And many evolutionists for many years were laughing at this and saying that this is not a dinosaur because we know that dinosaurs don't eat grass.
I'm sorry. I take full personal responsibility for what's coming here. You see, in part 4 of my response to Matt's Science Falsely So-Called video, I had a little chuckle at the fact that he said, "Behemoth eats grass like an ox," while simultaneously showing a clip of a dinosaur eating not grass. I then went on to explain how grass didn't evolve until about 10 million years after the dinosaurs went extinct. Unfortunately, because this was a very minor point that doesn't actually matter in the grand scheme of things, I wasn't as thorough as I probably should have been and wound up using an old source from before grass was found in late Cretaceous coprolite. Ever since then, Matt has gleefully repeated this as though the entire case for Behemoth not being a dinosaur rested on the non-existence of grass during the time of the dinosaurs, when in reality, that was nothing more than a quick jab. But since this is the only time when Matt has ever been right about a thing, he's latched onto it like a breastfeeding baby.
Well, one day some scientists had found some coprolites, dinosaur dung, and they analyzed it, and they found that dinosaurs actually did eat grass.
As mentioned, it was from the late Cretaceous, which was just before the dinosaurs went extinct. It pushed the earliest date for the evolution of grasses back by about 10 million years, but by no means does this indicate that grass were the primary food source for any dinosaurs. Quite the contrary, the coprolite in question led researchers to conclude that that particular dinosaur fed indiscriminately on plant matter. Notably, the most significant aspect of this find was that it explains why some mammals from the time had teeth that seemed to be well adapted for grazing. When we thought that grass had not yet evolved, that was an oddity in search of an explanation. But now we know. The explanation is that grass did exist, so the adaptations for grazing made sense.
Check this article out. It says, "Fossil dung reveals dinosaurs did graze grass." Textbooks have long taught that grasses did not become common until long after the dinosaurs died at the end of the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago. Depicting dinosaurs munching on grass was considered by experts to be as foolish as showing prehistoric humans hunting dinosaurs with spears.
I don't think that it was. Again, this is not a scientific paper. This is a news article where the primary goal is to create engaging content that keeps visitors on the website long enough to see as many ads as possible rather than being 100% accurate, so some hyperbole is expected. But even before this discovery, grass was thought to have originated 10 million years after the dinosaurs. Humans didn't evolve until the first members of the Homo genus appeared about 2 to 3 million years ago. So with the old timeline for grass evolution, it would have been at least 10 million years out of place, a time frame for which it is plausible that some evolutionary precursors to grass could have existed, but we hadn't found any as of yet. But the humans would have been over 60 million years out of place, so showing humans alongside dinosaurs would definitely have been more ridiculous than showing grass with them, and even putting the hyperbole aside, what this amounts to is scientists were wrong about a thing, and then changed their position when presented with new evidence. That is a good thing. But all that is relatively beside the point. News articles gonna do what news articles do, after all. That's why I try to go directly to the peer-reviewed shit when possible.
The Bible says about the brachiosaur, Behemoth, it says, "He moveth his tail like a cedar, the sinews of his stones are wrapped together."
Yep. Glad you included the part about his stones, because as we all learned while reading Shakespeare in high school, stones is a common euphemism for testicles. With that in mind, do you know what tail is a common euphemism for? I'll give you a hint. It's something that is very closely related to the stones. If, by some anti-miracle, you just haven't figured it out yet, it's a dick. This is a biblical dick joke.
The Bible is describing these dinosaurs, and it describes an animal that had a tail as big as a cedar tree.
Sorry, Matt. Gonna have to subtract some points for reading comprehension. At no point did that verse say anything about it being as big as a cedar tree. It said it moves like a cedar tree. And what's even better here is that the word that's translated as moves can also be translated as extends or makes stiff. So, do you know what body part is often euphemistically called a tail, but can extend and be made stiff while being closely associated with the testicles? It's not a tail, it's the dick. So what this verse is actually saying is that Behemoth has big muscly balls and gets boners that are stiff as a tree.
And theistic evolutionists who will compromise will say, well, that's an elephant that it's talking about. Well, excuse me, an elephant doesn't move its tail like a cedar tree.
No, but they sure do get big boners. Though stiff might not be the appropriate word for that, since elephants have prehensile penises that they can use for stuff like scratching their belly when the trunk doesn't reach. Wish I had a prehensile penis. But I actually think it was more probably a hippo. If we read the full description, which goes from verse 15 to verse 24, it doesn't end at the "he's really big" descriptors. It talks about some behavior, and not just the eating of grass. Verses 21 through 23 say, "Under the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade the lotus trees cover him, the willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he is not frightened, he is confident though the Jordan rushes against his mouth." Now, there is some ambiguity about what plant lotus tree is actually referring to here, but all the likely candidates are rather small, and the water lily type thing that we think of when we say lotus today is definitely not something that a sauropod could lie under. Reeds are also not terribly tall, and this animal can shelter in the reeds. Reeds are basically just tall grasses, but like tall to a hippo, not a sauropod. And that describes behaviors that hippos engage in. Here's a hippopod hanging out in the reeds together, and here's a hippo lying under the lotus plant. Okay, maybe those aren't actually lotus plants, but it's in the same vein. So yeah, if you read the whole description, it may not be a hippo, it might be something else, but it's definitely not a sauropod as creationists claim.
It's clear that this creature had a gigantic
dick. Oh, sorry, he probably was going to say something else.
Tail, that it was huge. And so you can look and compare the tail of an elephant or the tail of a hippopotamus, as they will claim Behemoth was, with the tail of a brachiosaur.
Okay, that's great, but again, it doesn't say that it was as big as a tree. It says it could be made stiff like a tree. So show me a sauropod's dick and then we can talk.
And it's pretty obvious what the truth is on that.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty obvious that it's a biblical dick joke. Thank you for agreeing with me, Matt.
In the creation model, we believe in what's known as Noah's flood. But according to evolution, uniformitarianism is true.
Uniformitarianism is mostly true, but this is a false dichotomy. It isn't a choice between uniformitarianism and Noah's flood. It's not even a choice between uniformitarianism and catastrophism. Geologists are perfectly happy to acknowledge the role that large-scale catastrophes can play in the geologic record, but for the most part, the deposition of sediments is a slow and gradual process.
And basically what uniformitarianism is the idea that everything slowly accumulates geologically, that all of the layers that you see outside and see like in the Grand Canyon, for example, are caused by local floods or just slow accumulation of rock layers over time.
I think that might be the record for the longest that Matt has gone without saying something mind-numbingly idiotic. Well done, Matt! I mean, it wasn't 100% accurate, but baby steps. We'll get you there eventually, Matty boy.
And we can also do some comparative analysis between a global flood and local floods and see which one is correct.
We can do that. And since you've already pointed out that not all deposition is flood deposition, but that there are some other types of layers that accumulate more slowly than floods, Noah's flood has already lost even by your own admission.
We actually find fossilized clams on the top of Mount Everest.
And that has nothing to do with the various rates of deposition in the various environments represented in the geologic record.
And they're in the closed position, which means they were catastrophically buried and then pushed up the mountain through rapid plate tectonics, catastrophic plate tectonics.
Being closed does not mean that they were catastrophically buried. It's not hard to push a dead clamshell closed. Being buried just a little bit would be enough to do it. And wouldn't it be super inconvenient for you if I were to play a clip of a clam burying itself right now? Yep, definitely won't be doing that. Wouldn't want to embarrass Matt after all. Oh, come on, you know I'm gonna do it. Here's the clip. But also, floods are not the only type of event that can catastrophically bury things. Underwater mudslides are a thing that can happen, and I don't know if you're aware of this, Matt, but they happen all the time without the entire planet being flooded. As to the catastrophic plate tectonics, creationist geologist John Baumgartner calculated that the amount of tectonic activity required by the creationist model of Noah's flood would have resulted in enough heat to completely vaporize 25 kilometers of water over the entire Earth. And in order to make things work, God would have had to have monkeyed with the laws of physics. So, for the evolutionary model, closed clams are explained by sometimes being in situations where they are closed after death, a thing that we know happens, followed by millions of years of slow continental movement that uplifted them to mountains, a process that we can see happening today. But for the creation model, it's necessary to break the laws of physics in order to prevent the floodwaters from turning Noah's Ark into an assortment of poached meats. You are welcome to believe in an event that requires the suspension of the laws of physics in order to work, but you don't get to pretend that such a belief is in any way scientific.
These clams were closed shut. They were sealed by something so powerful that they could not even open when they died.
I'm as powerful as Noah's flood! Not gonna let it go to waste.
Mount Everest is great evidence of Noah's flood because you're not going to get a mountain that big on this Earth unless a catastrophic event takes place.
Why not? Is this your incredibly dumb gravity erodes mountains faster than they grow argument? It is, isn't it? Okay, let's let him say it.
And if you get a mountain that huge, that means that the event must have happened very quickly because mountains are actually eroding over time. Everything is going to erode flat over time. Mountains are eroding, hills are eroding.
Okay, maybe he's not going to put it that bluntly in this one. Perhaps this is another instance of him changing his tune slightly in response to my critiques. Yes, I'm keeping that take even though I said perhaps as though it's two different words. Fuck you. I'm not... One take. But yeah, this is still a really bad argument. Because, you see, while it is true that erosion is a thing that happens, it does not happen equally everywhere. Erosional rates vary depending on local conditions. The Himalayas are particularly difficult to study both due to physical inaccessibility and political considerations, but it actually appears as though erosion is a process that, somewhat counterintuitively, allows mountains to grow higher than they otherwise would. The continents are essentially floating on the mantle, and while the mantle is made out of solid material, it is hot enough and under high enough pressure that it behaves like a very viscous fluid when looked at on timeframes greater than a couple centuries. As such, the continents are effectively floating on the mantle. So for an example of how this can work, let's head upstairs to my tub. Gotta prepare for a bath. Oh, right, science. Yeah, so imagine this is a continent floating on the mantle. It's our reliable ship, the HMS Leftovers. Put heavy things in it, like some nice, sweet Canadian scratch. And you see how it's sitting lower in the mantle. No, you don't, because realistically, I'm only doing this in one take and I probably have it framed like shit. But yeah, just trust me, it is. I'll give you a loony if you trust me. Loony not good enough? Might have a toonie. I don't think I have a toonie. Patreon.com/ViceRhino. I didn't bring a towel. The same thing happens at large scales. The weight of the land... I know how jackets work. The weight of the landmass actually makes it sit lower in the mantle. If something happens to that landmass that decreases its weight, it will sit higher in the mantle. This process is known as isostatic rebound and is most commonly the result of glaciation. Big, massive chunk of ice sits on a landmass, pushing it down, ice melts, land pops back up. But the same applies to erosion. In fact, for some mountain ranges in temperate climates, it's estimated that about 25% of their height can be attributed to isostatic rebound resulting from erosion. In other words, the very erosional processes that you are describing make it possible for the mountains to grow even taller than they would just due to tectonic activity.
And yes, evolutionists make the claim that the plates are moving really slowly and that's what's forming the mountains.
Matt, do you deny that the tectonic plates move? Because that's a thing that demonstrably is happening and is precisely measured using GPS satellites. Hell, I don't even need to go to secular evolutionist sources like the USGS. Andrew Snelling, a creationist geologist, when writing for Answers in Genesis, said the idea that continents move sounds crazy until you look at the facts. In that article, he goes over how we know that tectonic activity is happening today, and only talks about the flood for a couple of paragraphs at the very end, claiming that this is when the crust of the Earth first broke into the tectonic plates that we can see moving today. So, once again, Matt is showing himself to be so bad at creationisting that I can prove him wrong using other creationists.
Look, gravity is going to pull those mountains down faster than they can be brought up by plate tectonics.
Oh, damn, there it is. Should have just let him talk a bit longer. Technically, since buoyancy is a gravitational force, and buoyancy is responsible for isostatic rebound, which is a significant factor in increasing the height of mountain ranges, then gravity is actually what makes it possible for the mountains to get as tall as they do. So Matt isn't just wrong here, he is exactly wrong.
If the plates are only moving 1 to 2 inches per year and slowly changing the landscape, that's not going to create something like this. It's not going to create any mountain.
Why not? Do you plan on justifying that statement in any way at all?
In fact, everything would just be flat everywhere.
God damn it, Matt. No, it obviously wouldn't. So for example, if we take continent llama, continent bear, smush them together, they crash into each other. Oh, you see how they went up? I was kind of hoping the bear's butt would go up so we could have Mount Bear Bottom, but we got Mount Bear Llama Kiss Hug thing.
So mountains are great evidence of Noah's flood. A well-preserved whale fossil has been discovered on a California mountain. The nearly intact fossil of a whale has been unearthed at a construction site in Santa Cruz County.
Well, at least this time he's not showing screenshots of articles published on Talk Origins that explicitly debunk the claims that he's making. But yeah, whale on mountain is just as much of a non-problem for evolutionists as clams on Everest. It was on the seafloor, then tectonic activity uplifted it to a mountain. And this doesn't really matter, but isn't it Santa Cruz, not Santa Cruz? Like, I know I'm not someone that should be commenting on other people's pronunciation. Me saying things wrong is kind of a running joke on my channel, but Santa Cruz is a really easy one to get right, even for us gringos.
After reading this, the question then becomes, how does a whale get to the top of a mountain?
Actually, my question is, why do you know the answer for clams but not the whale? It's the same answer.
The only explanation is that the whale was catastrophically buried in Noah's flood.
No, it's not, because floods take sediments from high places and move them to low places, not the other way around. The only answer is plate tectonics. You just don't think they can happen slowly for some reason. Apparently, it's only possible for plate tectonics to operate at speeds that have been determined by creationists to be impossible without divine intervention. But continuing to operate at speeds that we see them operating today for long periods of time? Just completely unthinkable and impossible.
You find sea life on every single mountain. That's why you find clams on mountains that are in the closed position, because we're talking about catastrophic processes that placed these organisms there.
Is he seriously backtracking his earlier support for catastrophic plate tectonics? It sounds like he's saying they all died on the mountaintops now, rather than on the seafloor, followed by the tectonic uplift.
We also find trees that go through millions of years of geologic time.
No, we don't. We find creationists not understanding the fact that different depositional environments deposit sediment at different rates, which is weird because that is a trivially easy thing to understand. A volcanic eruption puts down a layer of ash way faster than the slow accumulation of coccolithophore exoskeletons on a calm seafloor.
That means that these layers are not millions of years old.
No, it doesn't. Hell, even if I grant that the layers formed as quickly as Matt is suggesting in one single flood event, it says nothing to their overall age. The whole shebang could still be millions of years old, even if it only took 1 year to form. Like, my house is nearly 100 years old, but it was built in probably less than 2 years. The fact that it only took 2 years to build doesn't mean that it can't be a century old. But that's granting too much, because there's no way the layers of the Grand Canyon formed in 1 year in one worldwide flood.
That they didn't take that much time to accumulate, that what actually caused them to accumulate was rapid succession of layers being laid down by water.
Rapid succession of layers being laid down? Yes. By water? Not necessarily. Sometimes it was, but other times it was volcanic activity. Also, rapid doesn't mean what Matt needs it to mean. Some of them could have been formed in a single event, like a flood or an eruption, but there could also be some layers that are the result of slower deposition on the order of decades or even centuries, like peat accumulation. That is still geologically rapid, but unfortunately for Matt, it doesn't fit in with a single flood event. And that's not even getting into the fact that a single flood event would not form multiple layers, but would in fact form a single thick conglomerate layer.
And this had to have been the case because trees, when they die, they fall over.
Sometimes not for a few hundred years, during which things like floods and volcanic eruptions can and do happen, but yeah, eventually they will.
Well, what tree is going to stand for millions of years as layers slowly accumulate around it?
No tree is going to do that. Good thing nobody says that they did. Like, that's why these trees are only ever found in the types of layers that accumulate relatively quickly. But I guess in order to figure that out, you'd have to actually, read about it and understand what you're reading. Gross.
So these polystratofossils, which is what they're called, is some of the greatest evidence of Noah's flood.
No, they're not, and they're only called polystrate fossils by creationists, and that's polystrate, not polystrata. To actual scientists, they're usually known as either T0 assemblages or upright fossil trees.
And of the fact that layers don't take millions of years to form. The Grand Canyon's layers did not take millions of years of rainfall.
It's more than a bit disingenuous to jump from upright fossil trees and the layers surrounding them to the Grand Canyon. Upright fossil trees are almost exclusively found in strata that indicate low-lying wetlands. There are almost none from any other climate. And this is precisely because the types of layers that can form fast enough without just knocking the trees over are more likely to form in those environments as well. The Grand Canyon, however, represents dozens of entire environments and ecosystems, and to the best of my knowledge, it does not contain any T0 assemblages.
It took one gigantic, catastrophic event.
And that one gigantic catastrophic event somehow laid down sediment that indicates both shallow marine environments and arid desert environments at exactly the same time. Sure sounds reasonable to me.
And some skeptics will say that little local floods could cause these layers to form around the trees.
Oh, we're back at the trees, are we? Dude is obviously reading from notes, but somehow can't stop himself from getting distracted by irrelevant bits. Yes, small local floods can rapidly deposit layers, and that is one type of event that can do so around the base of a tree without destroying that tree.
Well, whatever created these fossils had to have been so catastrophic, because the trees, many of them, are upside down.
Oh god, this again. Last time Matt mentioned this, I searched long and hard for a source for this claim, and it always seems to come back to Ian Juby or Harold Coffin. Juby is a hack who doesn't have the slightest idea what he's talking about. His arguments are almost as bad as Matt's. But Harold Coffin is more respectable? Would that be the word to use here? He's respectable among creationists. I've searched again, and once again, they are pretty much all I can find. Coffin does seem to be the ultimate origin of this claim as far as I can tell, and he only makes a passing mention of such trees in his book, not really tying much significance to them, and even explaining himself that it wouldn't be unusual for a log to get stuck on a beach in such an orientation during a local flood. meaning that the existence of the occasional upside-down tree would not be unexpected. But unless there's some scientific term that creationists are once again obscuring that I'm just unaware of, it seems as though such finds are exceptionally rare, if not completely non-existent.
Obviously, some of these trees were ripped out by literal earthquakes, and they floated around for a while, became waterlogged, went upside down into these layers that were still soft, and then all of those layers solidified around them, and the tree and the layers together became fossilized in one event.
But then, why is it only trees, or for the pedants in the audience, tree-like lycopods? And why is it that in T0 assemblages, evidence of plants beginning to grow and animals making burrows and stuff can be found in nearly every layer around the tree? How does that happen if they're the result of one single massive flooding event that killed everything in it?
This I find interesting. It says the monkeys that sailed across the Atlantic to South America.
Oh, are we gonna get the surfing monkeys again? It really is weird to me, knowing that Matt watches my videos, to see which points he changes based on my responses and which he just keeps around. In this case, the main problem with Matt's position here is that it doesn't matter whether we're looking at things from a perspective of geologic time and evolution or Noah's flood. The problem remains the same. How did monkeys get to South America? And in fact, the problem is worse for creationists. You see, creationists and the people who accept science all agree that the continents were joined into a supercontinent in the past. But for creationists, the continents broke apart during the flood that wiped out all life. So they have to answer the question of how did such and such get to this location for literally every type of plant and animal that exists anywhere that isn't directly connected to the Middle East. But in the evolutionary model, there were plants and animals on these continents when they split millions of years ago, so for the most part, the plants and animals that live there are simply the descendants of the ones who were there when they split. The only time we have to answer the question of how an animal or a plant got there is when we find something that is clearly out of place. In this case, molars were found that are consistent with a group of African primates that would have been out of place for South American primates. Since rafting is a thing that happens sometimes, even today, and since the time during which these primates would have had to arrive in South America was also a time when South America was significantly closer to Africa, rafting is a plausible hypothesis for how they could have gotten there. Notably, scientists are often accused by creationists of suppressing evidence that would support creationism and twisting the evidence that they don't suppress to make it seem to fit the evolutionary picture better than it otherwise would. So, what happened here? They didn't need to publish findings that indicated the African primates were found in South America. If there was some big scientific conspiracy to suppress anything that doesn't support evolution, and this find would indeed fail to support evolution, then they could have just labeled them as a new species of South American primate and moved on. The fact that the question of how those primates got there even came up is itself evidence that no such conspiracy exists. Even more so if the only possible explanation seems ridiculous. After all, why pose a difficult question that needs answering if your goal is just to publish information that supports the answer you already decided on? Well, in the case of science, it's because we actually want to learn new things, to understand the world and how we got here, how things work, etc. A difficult question is exciting to scientists. The more difficult the question, the more important the answering of that question will be in the history books. There is no significance in pushing conclusions that have already been decided on in advance, which is why creationists are ultimately doomed. Eventually, when their movement finally fizzles out, they will be nothing more than a quirk of history, a study in the psychology of belief. Not that I think all fare much better in the history books. Best I can hope for is in a couple hundred years some rando will stumble onto this video, hear me say that, and think to himself, this guy was a bit prescient, before going back to living their normal life and never giving me another thought. Hi rando from 200 years in the future. Has Tesla finally rolled out actual full self-driving yet, or is it still just glorified cruise control?
Monkeys suddenly appeared in South America about 40 million years ago. Unlikely though it may seem, they probably sailed there from Africa. Prehistoric monkeys traveled 900 miles between continents on rafts. The reason that atheists will promote this idea that monkeys surfed from Africa to South America is because they're trying to explain how monkey fossils got to South America.
Yes, people propose explanations in order to explain the thing that the explanation explains. Congratulations on figuring that out. The reason I told my partner that I couldn't get it up was because I just couldn't stop thinking about that scene in Deadpool and Wolverine where Wolverine chops off the tip of Deadpool's penis with his claws, was in order to explain why I couldn't get it up. Explanations explain things. Brilliant sleuthing, Matt.
Well, number one, you find a fossil in South America. You can't just conclude that monkeys surfed over there.
They didn't. Nobody said that they surfed. Like, I'm sure you probably could find a news article that used hyperbolic language like that if you tried, but so far the only sources that you've even shown say they rafted. Not sure if you're aware of this, Matt, but sitting on a raft is very different from surfing.
I mean, even if they were, they still got buried and killed.
Everything dies eventually. Did you think that we thought that they were immortal monkeys? Are there immortal monkeys in South America? Is that the real solution to how you get monkeys to type out the works of Shakespeare? You don't need infinite monkeys, you just need one monkey with infinite time. Well, I for one welcome our new immortal monkey overlords.
And this looks more to me like Noah's flood was actually the cause of these findings, because to get a fossil, you have to have rapid burial. And not only that, if you're finding monkey fossils in places where they're not supposed to be, the flood is what would shuffle up all of this biology and put it in all sorts of different places for us to find later.
Okay, sure, whatever. But how did the monkeys that are supposed to be in South America get there after the flood, Matt? How'd they do it? We've both got the same problem here, but one of us has a lot more time for it to be solved than the other.
And so Noah's flood is what put these fossils there. It's not that the monkeys surfed across the ocean 34 million years ago. It's that God allowed the earth to be flooded because of the wickedness of man.
God murdered a bunch of monkeys because of the wickedness of man. Sounds legit.
And God decided to start over with Noah and his family.
Yay! Incest! Don't clip that. Please.
And that's totally fine. That's up to God.
And there you have it, straight from Matt's pretty little Why'd I write that in the script? Ugh. Genocide, followed by repopulation via incest, is perfectly fine, according to Matt.
We shouldn't consider ourselves smarter than God or have an issue with God for wiping out the planet.
Well, that's kind of the crux here, isn't it? If a god exists, it is almost definitely smarter than I am. I'm just some idiot YouTuber after all, but I am way smarter than the idiot that God is portrayed as in the Bible. He regularly throws temper tantrums that have massive death tolls. So if God exists, it ain't the Christian God because that dude's an idiot.
He did it once. He could do it again if he wanted to.
Didn't he promise not to? Well, I mean, he specifically promised not to do it with water again, so technically he could use anything else and that'd be fine? Yay! Divine loopholes that allow God to go on genocidal sprees whenever it tickles his fancy. Such a good God that we should worship.
Via fire, and the Bible even tells us that he will.
Right, guess I cut in too soon there. Matt, you worship a genocidal maniac, and you are saying as much here. If your moral compass is so broken that that's okay to you, then you're probably beyond hope.
The Bible says the elements will melt with a fervent heat. God does have wrath towards people who hate him.
You know, some hippie once said, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." That hippie was Jesus Harold Christ. What you are saying here, Matt, is that human beings are being held to higher expectations than the all-powerful, all-knowing God of the universe. Jesus, who you believe was God, said that having anger and wrath for those who hate you is petty. To be perfect is to love everyone, treat everyone well, regardless of how they feel about you. To be fair, he did kind of undercut that whole point when he talked about hell, or said that you have to hate your family in order to follow him, but still, the point remains that if God is allowed to be angry and wrathful at those who hate him, but we aren't, then that means that he has placed unreasonably high expectations on humans, making his judgment against us unjust even by his own metrics.
You shouldn't hate your creator. You should love your creator.
Well, then maybe my creator should do something to make himself worthy of love. The act of creation does not in and of itself justify love for the creator. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Sir Sick Crusader, who says, "Apparently great minds think alike." Or fools seldom differ, as my grandfather would say. We both responded to the exact same Father Casey video on the exact same day with zero coordination, and we both made a bunch of the same observations, but with our own flair. For example, I said that the greatest god ever would give blowjobs on demand. Sir Sick said it'd be soapy handjobs. Anyway, go give his video a watch if you haven't yet, and hide all the new peeps who found me through the algorithm recognizing that we both did the same thing at the same time, and so cross-recommended our videos. I'm not as sweary as Sir Sick, and tend to go on long tangents about semi-related science because ADHD hyperfocus is a thing that happens, but yeah, here I am. Do with me as you please, Daddy. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Sirs every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the monkeys that surf their way over to the continent that is my channel. If you'd like to be a caricature of a solution to a problem that is shared by both creationists and evolutionists, but more so for creationists, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.viceround.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! They're cross-referencing the creationist cross-referencing. Apparently that's a hard thing to say. Did that make it wider or tighter?
Tighter.
Tighter? How's that?
No, that made it tighter.
Oh my god. You're the worst DP ever.